It was the top.
Okay, thank you. I hadn't learned that last set of sign language yet. Or usually you give me that one instead of. Okay, we're on. Welcome everyone back to Church of Light streaming television. The planets in Hermetic Astrology. This is class 7 on Saturn. I'm supposed to tell you all to silence your cell phones. I think I put mine in the other room, and we'll get started. Please, everybody who's out there, sign in, let us know you're out there. It's great to have a big group. This class seems to be expanding and growing. Those of you who have not yet done so that are online, you can download the handouts for tonight's class by going to the right-hand side of your screen for class number 7. You'll see the PDF icon for handouts, and by clicking on that, you can open up that file and print those out so you can follow along with us. Sometimes the images on your screen, because we're working with a PowerPoint presentation and film projection, some of the details are lost. However, you do have all of the details in your handouts, especially when we get to the portion of tonight's class where we're actually looking at a sample chart. And I want you to be able to see that with detail. Any questions from the students at large?
Marianne has one about the
earthquakes in Hawaii, in Chile.
And that axis shifting and...
Yeah, as far as I understand, the axis shifted 3 inches, and I believe time sped up by 1/1,000,000 of a second. I don't know if any of you have felt that or not, but in case it seems like things are going faster, they are. I haven't studied. It's hard to know what to look for in terms of earthquakes, and there's a lot of different theories out there. So the answer to that, Marianne, is no. I haven't studied what the astrological factors may have been in the Chilean earthquake. Vicki?
Well, one of the environmental factors I understand is the fact that there is the global warming, and that does tend to impact the lava flow and the structure of the earth, interior structure of the earth. Yeah. So that's an environmental condition.
Right, and I think she's asking about astrological conditions. I know it was a full moon, but in all of the earthquakes I've studied, there is no evidence that they happen more on full moons or new moons that I can remember. So one can certainly look at the chart for Chile, much as when we had the Hurricane Katrina and the other hurricanes, Andrew. One can look at the United States chart for progressed aspects and see what's going on. One can do weather charts. I'm not sure if unusual weather like earthquakes show up there. But personally, I find earthquake prediction to be incomplete using astrology. So, but definitely if you're looking at a nation's chart, 4th house factors, which are the physical environment, you have to look to progressions impacting the 4th house. And the same in weather charts, you specifically look to the 4th house. And I know traditionally speaking, and this is something we'll talk about in 2 weeks when we do Neptune, but the ancient Greeks called earthquakes the horses of Poseidon. So there is the possibility that Neptune factors into earthquakes, and that could be observed. All right, we'll move forward in our slideshow for tonight. A quote from one of my heroes: "The earth provides enough to satisfy every man's needs, but not every man's greed." Mohandas Gandhi, and this is my quote to introduce the planet Saturn. For those of you hearing some movement, Vicky is in the back trying to adjust the sound of the north wind blowing through our cracks of our door. All right, let's talk about Saturn. Saturn, the sixth planet from the Sun, is the second largest of the classical planets that can be seen with the naked eye. His brightness is slightly less than Jupiter, and he can be seen now basically in the early morning sky. If you're up late at night, you can see Saturn, or if you get up really early like I do and go outside, you can see Saturn.
Do you know what constellation he's in?
I think he was close to Taurus, but I wouldn't say that with any certainty. One could go online and find that information.
Mars
It
is
would be
close to
more
Uranus, so-
it'd be more reliable than getting it from me. Now, Saturn is perhaps the most visibly remarkable object in our solar system due to his prominent system of rings, composed primarily of dust and ice. Within these rings orbit Saturn's 60 moons. The largest of these, Titan, is bigger than Mercury and the second largest moon in our solar system after Jupiter's Ganymede. It takes Saturn approximately 29.5 years to move through the entire zodiac. Saturn spends about 2.5 years in each sign. And that leads to the cycles that we talk about as being Saturn returns. This came up as a brief discussion tonight at the dinner table. And basically, this can happen depending on how fast Saturn's moving, anywhere from, your 28th year to your 30th year, where Saturn goes back to the same degree and minute of the zodiac that it held at the time of your birth. And many astrological systems attribute sort of significant life events to these particular cycles. Saturn, transiting cycles of Saturn, Saturn returns, also tend to correspond roughly to one's progressed lunar return, which happens also about every 28.5 years. So there is a theme going on as we hit 28 and 56, and if we should live so long, add another 29 to that. All right, Saturn's role in mythology. The youngest of the Titans, Kronos, or Saturn, was a harvest deity and frequently pictured holding a sickle. So in astrology, Saturn also represents real estate, farms, farming, commodities, etc., which goes back to these old-timey associations of Kronos. At the urgings of his mother Gaia, or Earth, he used his sickle to castrate and depose his father, Uranus, the sky. I've actually been spending the last month reading a lot of Greek mythology, and there's some pretty radical stories in there.
Yeah, that's a pretty radical image
Yeah,
there.
they think from watching Oprah and Jerry Springer and these other shows that families have trouble now. Well, even among the Titans, they had their issues. Well, to add to this telenovela. Kronos then took his sister Rhea as his wife, and they jointly ruled the throne of the world. Their period of rule in Greek mythology was known as the Golden Age. Saturnalia, the most popular of Roman festivals, took place the week of the winter solstice and commemorated this golden age of Kronos and Rhea. This old guy eating his children. Kronos was the symbol for both time and old age, and is said to have devoured his children, and those of us who are moving through middle age and beyond can sort of get the sense of what that idea is about. Remembering we were children was. Now, our concept of father time evolved from the Greek concept of Kronos. You don't see this much anymore, but I can remember as a child around New Year's, you always saw these images of Father Time and then a small baby in a top hat and diapers. Maybe he was the appetizer for Father Time. Who knows?
Did he also carry a sickle?
Or an hourglass, I think.
Oh,
Father Time carried the sickle, and I think the young child carried an hourglass.
Yeah.
I can remember being the smallest child, and those icons somehow really caught my attention. Now, to the Sumerians, Saturn was known as Ninurta, the farmer god, lord of earth and the plow. Saturn Day, or Saturday, is the only day of the week in English which is ruled by a Roman deity. Basically, all of our other weekdays come from Germanic or Old English or Nordic sources. Now, in other languages, Saturday was known as the Sabbath. This was the holy day of the Jews and the alleged day of rest, the seventh day of the biblical creation. So in Spanish and Portuguese, it's still called sábado, and sabato in Italian, and samedi in French. I love this picture. My paternal grandfather was a farmer, and my father used to always remind me that on Saturdays they bathed, whether they needed it or not. So, since the Vikings traditionally bathed on Saturday, it is called lørdag. And I can't pronounce Icelandic. If Vega was here, she could help us out. Let's try it. Lagardagur. Regardless, it means bath day. And this tradition came with all the Nordic folks that settled in the upper Midwest and in Nebraska and other parts of the U.S. And Saturday for farmers was bath day, whether you needed it or not. In Hindu astrology, Saturn is known as Shani, the great teacher who brings things through difficulty and perseverance. And I think we all could agree in Western astrology, he holds the same role. We think of Saturn as the great teacher within our charts. Welcome, Samara. Now, what's interesting is the mount of Shani is the crow, the blackbird. I like this image too. It looks like he has a little I'm going to interpret it as a black chihuahua, but we know we don't have chihuahuas in India, so they are a Mexican dog, but in my mind, it's a chihuahua. All right, let's look at what C.C. Zane says about the symbolism of Saturn in ancient Masonry. One of my long quotes for the evening. Saturn is symbolized by the crescent of the soul surmounted by the cross of matter. This signifies that the emotions, aspirations, and ideals are made subservient to material and self-centered ambitions. Temporal power is the motive, and all the feelings are repressed that action may result solely from deliberate consideration after due time for meditation. In natal astrology, we find that individuals dominated by Saturn are careful, deliberate, subtle, cautious, prudent, and practical. Their chief characteristic is the persistence with which they labor for their own selfish interest. The cross above, typifying forces in antagonism, expresses the thought that all things are subject to change, that all terrestrial life ends in death, and that the tomb is the leveler of all earthly rank and distinction. There's a cheery thought. Thus, the cross above the crescent became the scythe held in the hands of old Father Time. This is but one of the ancient conceptions relating to the planet Saturn as the orb of old age and dissolution. Saturn is considered to be the planet that represents old age, the geriatrics, the discomforts and heavy responsibilities that also come to us as a result of old age, and some of the other things that are also a part of the aging process that you'll see if you spend time in nursing homes or around old people, is they oftentimes become fearful, very much into holding on to their money or concerned that others are taking from them, that are only there for their money. So you can see this, this Saturn aura starts to surround many in old age. Not completely, but yes.
Do you think that selfishness necessarily has to be a bad thing?
Well, only from the Brotherhood of Light perspective, where if you read those lessons, basically from one book to the next, it implies that the antithesis to spirituality is selfishness. Yet at the same time, we're extolled that there has to be a certain amount of self-preservation, which is considered to be different than selfishness. Selfishness tends to be more grasping and wants to assert the gain of the individual above all others. Self-preservation, on the other hand, means that one can make decisions to look after themselves, to be able to preserve their own life and well-being, but the ultimate goal of being able to do more for others. So one of the things in any type of counseling profession that one learns early on is you have to take care of yourself if you're going to take care of others. If you're not taking care of yourself, you're taking care of others with resentment and bad feelings and or self-sacrifice. But the BFL lessons repeatedly imply that selfishness and self-centeredness is the opposite of spirituality.
So maybe selfishness is just an it's immaturity, or maybe there's evil, I don't know.
Well, it's fear-based.
It's fear-based.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, not always, but
Right.
like you say, it could be.
What's mine is mine and what's yours is mine.
Right.
That's how selfishness operates.
Right.
So, and the extreme cases of that are grab all that one can for oneself and screw the rest, is basically the attitude. That's the extreme side of Saturn, and we don't want to give a distorted view of Saturn tonight, because each of the planets has extremes, good and bad qualities, and it's all about what we do with it. But the element lead, which Saturn represents in alchemy, is considered the heaviest of the metals, the most toxic, and one of the hardest to convert or antidote. So the experiences of Saturn, which generally function from selfishness and self-centeredness, are the hardest qualities to transmute in order to become more spiritual. There was a long answer to a short question.
I think it's good to understand.
All right. What does Saturn do in a chart? Basically, where Saturn is in your chart, what do they call that thing they put on people's stomachs now, a lap band?
Oh, yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah. Saturn is like the lap band in your chart.
I don't know what that is.
Yeah, it's a surgery that's being done for to help reduce weight.
Oh, okay.
So where Saturn is in your chart, this generally indicates an area of your life where you are going to struggle with a lack of resources, where you experience some sense of restrictions, losses, confinements, where you may have your sorrows or your greatest sense of responsibilities. Is anyone feeling cheery out there? So, what we say is, where Saturn falls in your chart, this area is subject to poverty. What is poverty? Well, it's everything we described. Restrictions, lack, confinements. So, however, Saturn has positive qualities, and there is the rare individual, I know of at least one in this room, who has a positive Saturn in their chart. And Saturn can function well through system. And as we move further along and start looking at where these urges develop in us in early life forms, we'll also get the answer to Vicky's question, which is, in what way is selfishness good? And where does it play a role in our existence?
Would subsistence come into a Saturn kind of sphere?
Yes.
Because for some people it's a scary thing, and for other people it's just, that's life, and it's like
It describes my life well.
Yeah, mine too. But it's an interesting
So subsistence is a good thing.
But it's an interesting, the whole philosophical issue around all that and the values thing. And I'm thinking voluntary simplicity. I wonder whether that comes under it.
That is a positive Saturn. Voluntary simplicity is a positive Saturn. Mm-hmm. And that takes us back. You missed, I think, the first quote, which was from Gandhi. Mm-hmm. And that is, I'm going to repeat it to you, which is, it's at the top of your handouts. The earth provides enough to satisfy every man's needs, but not every man's greed. That is subsistence. That is voluntary simplicity.
So it's moderation too.
It is.
That whole thing.
Yeah.
What's moderate?
And that is the system of Saturn. If one can live within those restrictions, one can actually live a very rich life where you're not leaving a huge footprint on the earth. And, in the words of, who was it, Chief Seattle, who talks about, leaving enough for 7 generations down the line. It's that concept. And oftentimes we look at tribal cultures and or hunter-gatherer cultures that live a subsistence lifestyle as being very poor. But actually the amount of leisure time that is found in those cultures, we look at the lifestyles of the rich and famous as basically who's got the most leisure time. And in the subsistence cultures, there is a great deal of leisure time. They aren't spending 40 hours a week gathering wood, water, grubs, and wildebeest to eat. There's a lot of time spent playing, having fun, napping, and all the things that we all wish that we had enough money and time that we could do.
Would you say that stewardship comes into this, like, and conservation, all of those?
Conservation, those are great words, and when we get to our vocabulary,
I'm sorry.
positive, no. I like a mind that is grasping for vocabulary. But on to the negative traits, selfishness. Saturn is known in astrology as the major malefic, meaning that he is responsible for one-half discord. He brings to every aspect he forms with another planet one-half discord. Major malefic means basically big bad guy in the common tongue.
Christopher.
Yes.
Renee says, Christopher, when you spoke of Saturn's 28-year return, you mentioned a corresponding lunar pattern of similar length. Sorry, but would you repeat that?
Yes, Renee, the Saturn cycle is 29 and a half years, but depending on the speed at which Saturn's moving, it can be different from chart to chart, from 28 years to 30 years, approximately. Around the same amount of time, at about 28 and a half years, the moon, by major progression, returns back to its natal position within the chart. So oftentimes within months of one another, you have these two significant factors going on that usually create milestone periods in one's life. The first Saturn return and lunar return correspond to that age where one actually moves into adulthood. We tend to think of teenage years and early 20s as being somewhat self-centered. Most parents don't get to like their children until they're about 30, when they've had enough life experiences to think, how did my mom put up with me? And they start becoming more attentive, more sensitive, more responsible. Now, not everyone gets this. So, you do have another opportunity, which comes about another 28 years later. So, usually between the time you're 55 and 58, you get your second go-around to grow up. Most of us have plenty of aches and pains by then, and have had our knees redone or other parts. But that's the second time. For many people, it corresponds to a midlife crisis, and or what I've seen is a lot of depression happens around that time in people's lives. And or it becomes the building blocks from that sense of, okay, the end may not be that far away. And keep in mind that human beings throughout history, the average lifespan is about 45 years. When you read Greek mythology and somebody's 80 years old, you're talking about the exception rather than the common rule. When archaeologists go in and start digging up grave sites, the number of people who live to old age is not that great, and it's only been in the last century that we've started to see this incredible increase in lifespan. Where at 58, we're thinking, well, maybe I've got another 20 to 40 years left. How am I going to spend them? So, let's talk about where this comes from. If we look in the plant kingdom, think of Saturn as this sense of planning for the future. The selfishness positively expresses as self-preservation. And this is, and back to Vicky's question earlier, self-preservation is key. You don't get the opportunity to grow in this lifetime, gain spiritual lessons, evolve as a human being, unless you actually stay alive. So preserving one's life, staying alive, we consider to be a good thing. It's just how we do that is what brings into mind the issue of morals. How do we stay alive and do the least amount of harm in the world and the least amount of harm to other living creatures? Plants store water for times of future need. Here in the American Southwest and in other climates, parts of Australia, parts of South Africa, etc., one can find the ways in which plants have adapted to irregular rainfall. And to be able to preserve their life, they create these storage facilities. Here we're looking at barrel cactus, which after a rainy season, these things will just expand like an accordion and plump up, and then they will survive off of their own liquid pretty much through the drought periods. Bees. Here we live in a climate which has 4 full seasons. We don't have flowers here from October through till March. Actually, the end of February is when the very first flowers start to open up here in New Mexico. What do the bees do during that period of time? They had to figure out a way in which to store food to ensure their survival for the future. So the process of honey, which I lovingly refer to as bee vomit, is basically, yes, it's regurgitated bee vomit, is put aside in these wonderful little hexagonal cells, and it is used as a carbohydrate food substance throughout the winter. So think about that the next time you pour it over your cornbread.
Thank you very much, Mr. I used to like honey.
Squirrels hoard nuts for winter. Not only do they hoard them, but what do they have to do? And hide them and then find them again. You have to be able to remember where you put your food supply. So that part of memory is also Saturn ruled. Is where, not where you have hoarded something, where you have put your supplies aside. Some people save for a rainy day.
Is that Scrooge?
That is Scrooge. I thought he would represent a good Saturn character. I love that story. Dickens' Christmas Tale is a wonderful story about transmuting Saturn. Compulsive hoarding becomes a mental illness. I have known people where there were paths to get from one room to another. Everything is useful, Saturn. This will all be needed at some point.
I knew a house where the woman couldn't even use the shower because it was her whole bathroom
Was filled.
completely filled. She'd actually worked really hard to make a little path to get to the toilet. I mean, it was bad.
Glad she wasn't saving that.
Oh, bad. Exactly.
But I want to...
sign of health.
Yes.
And when as people get older, they tend to save things, not hoarding, but twisties, string,
Rubber bands, newspapers.
And they tend to pile up after a while.
Yes. Especially among the Great Depression generation. But those things, yeah, I'm guilty of some of those things in small amounts, and constantly work to purge of that particular habit. I call it recycling. Let others.
Which is kind of interesting when you think that a healthy Saturn would be about a structure and maybe setting healthy limits. So it's kind of interesting.
Right, one baggie full of twisties rather than a whole drawer might be a healthy limit. But when it starts to look like that, it becomes an issue. Now, I'd say a constructive form of Saturn, as a cultural group, I think Mormons have to be admired in a sense that they have, every household or family has emergency supplies. I forget, I think it has to be for like 10 years or something. But when Katrina disaster hit in New Orleans, who do you think was actually able to come in and help people? FEMA or the Latter-day Saints? It was the latter. And they had storehouses filled up. They had a system, an organized system in place to be able to provide supplies to the needy. Now, there's other things about that culture that I find personally quite scary, but nevertheless, this is one habit system that's in place, which when disaster strikes, if you're prepared, the way you get through it is much easier and less painful than if you're ill-prepared and have a cumbersome bureaucratic system in place. So this is a cultural group that has actually mastered this method of system, planning for the future, and being able to make it through disaster with the least pain possible.
Is it an individualized system or is it a collective system?
It's a collective,
So
individualized and collective.
So they'll do it at home and then they'll have
Yes.
little kind of community-based store
Exactly.
facilities. Oh, wow. Wow, that's really good.
Yeah, it's brilliant, truly brilliant the way in which it's done. So, in astrology, please watch safety, Barb, as you go up and down those stairs.
The Saturn thing going on.
I'm not sure if OSHA will approve of our arrangement there. The thought cell in a chart, we consider the urges of the soul that Saturn rules to be safety urges. These are the desires which you saw in the cactus, in the bees, in the squirrels, in the human beings, that sense of safety for the future, being able to self-preserve is a strong motivating factor. And on this level, this facet of what we might call selfishness or self-preservation is important. The house in which Saturn falls, however, is subject to poverty, and that means restricted influences. What you gain through that house comes through great effort. The metal, alchemically, this corresponds to lead. That's the ores of galena, from which lead is extracted. Lead, we already mentioned, is toxic, it's heavy, it's weighty, it's dark, it's morose, and it represents the ores of Saturn in our lives, the difficulties that we encounter. Gemstones, if you could even call them that, these are actually organic substances, but they're used in talismans. Basically, bone and ivory are considered to be the talismans of Saturn. Now, ivory these days is a restricted substance, and for the most part it comes from endangered species. So the only ivory I think that's allowed into this country is fossilized ivory, fossilized walrus tusk and things of that nature, which are not from recently deceased endangered species. The color associated with Saturn is dark blue. What do we say when we're depressed? Yeah, I've got the blues. In fact, there's a whole genre of music, singing the blues, that corresponds to this timbre of song. Musical tone G. The part of the body is the spleen, our teeth and skeletal system. And I cannot remember the teacher that told me this, but the imagery has always stuck with me. One of my early astrology teachers said, think about it. Without Saturn, what would we look like? If you take the skeletal system out of the body, you basically have a 5-pointed bag of flesh. So, Saturn gives us shape and structure and form and what we might call backbone. That's your spleen, in case you didn't know what it looked like. Bones and teeth. Let's go on to another long quote, which comes from Mental Alchemy. You also have these in your handout, so you don't have to take them down word for word. You can refer to these later. But thinking about fear, caution, acquisition, greed, system, and selfish wants brings into the life all those conditions which come through lack and poverty, or through systematic and careful planning and forethought. Discordant thoughts of this type, especially fear, greed, envy, and self-centeredness, are responsible for much loss and hardship, for privation, and the necessity of working diligently for every advantage, for restrictions of various kinds and heavy burdens. Such discordant thinking always afflicts through deficiency and is responsible for cancer, fibrous tumor, pellagra. I meant to look that up today because people don't seem to have that much anymore. But I think that was a vitamin deficiency. Does that anyone remember? Atrophy, and, listen up, constipation. And is chiefly responsible for tuberculosis. This statement is so important. Fear and selfishness are the most unprofitable things in the world, for the thought cells so formed attract losses into the life and develop chronic diseases in the body. So from the alchemical perspective, this is from Mental Alchemy. The most important work we can do, since most of the problems in our lives are brought in through Saturn, the most important work we can do is to rid ourselves of fear and selfishness. More easily said than done. But it is a good daily practice. So, harmonious Saturn, planning, organization, the development of systems, preparation and safety-mindedness, foresight and prescience, personal discipline and structure, accountability, shouldering duties and responsibilities, conscientiousness. None of these things make us think, oh, I want to do that on my next vacation. But nevertheless, they don't make us feel badly. It just all sounds like work. The alternative is experiences with greed and selfishness, prolonged hardships, illness and physical disabilities, heavy responsibilities, losses, poverty, sorrows, grief, and depression are all negative Saturn experiences. So let's go on to our vocabulary builders. These are a lot of words, but I'm going to run through them because they give the mood of positive Saturn. accountable, capable, careful, cautious, circumspect, competent, compliant, conforming. A word you used earlier, conservative or conservation, Samara, is a Saturn quality. Conventional, dependable, determined, diplomatic, discreet, dutiful, economical, efficient, established, exacting, foresight, functional, frugal, habitual, judicious, no frills, orderly, organized, planning, practical, predictable, prescient, prepared, preserving, proficient, protective, prudent, purposeful, reliable, resolute, responsible, safety-minded, shrewd, sensible, steadfast, structured, systematic, thrifty, traditional, utilitarian, vigilant, wary, and watchful. Not necessarily the person you want to invite to your next party, but it might be the person you want to throw your next party.
Yeah, exactly.
What's prescient?
To see before, to
Anticipate.
to see ahead of time. To be prescient is to see something before it happens. All right. The negative vocabulary for Saturn, the qualities of acquisitiveness, being afraid, apprehensive, anxious, ascetic, austere. Some might claim ascetic is actually goes onto the positive list. But
Sounds lovely.
yeah, it sounds miserable. Avaricious, boring, burdened, calculating, cheap, covetous, discouraging, dispiriting, dry, dreary, dull, fearful, formal, frightened, gloomy, glum, grasping, grave, greedy, grim. There's a great alliterative line. Habitual, impoverished, inflexible, lackluster, limiting, materialistic, monotonous, to be overburdened, plotting or plotting, reserved, restraining, rigid, routine, scheming, self-centered, selfish, serious, severe, sober, solemn, Spartan, stern, stoic, and strict. Again, we might argue that some of these could actually be placed on the harmonious list, but I think the day I was writing this, they didn't sound very pleasant to me. And then we move on to tedious, timid, troubled, unbending, uncompromising, unyielding, and worried. So these are all Saturn experiences. Are we having fun yet?
Workaholic?
Yeah, well, that would be under W. Yeah, that would come before worried. Yes. So please add workaholic to your list. Any questions so far from the peanut gallery out there? Okay, we'll move on. Let's look at Saturn occupations. For some reason, I did not come up with a lot, and I'm sure there are plenty others out there, but after working on the last list, I was so worn out that I was severely lacking in imagination. A very Saturn quality. So, agriculturalist, chiropractor, commodities broker, cryogenics operator, dentist, locksmith, miner, an osteopath, protective services of any kind, such as children's protective services or those who protect the elderly, a researcher, the person who lets you into your safe deposit box or your storage area.
About architects.
Architects, thank you. Add that to the top. A. Farmers,
Actuary.
an actuary,
Chiropractor.
and their actuarial tables. Very Saturn.
Chiropractor. What about somebody who takes care of things like bookkeeping and
Thank you.
all that kind of
Yeah,
stuff?
accountants, bookkeepers. I don't know why I was so unimaginative, but I think I just
You
What
shut
about
down.
I did.
That's
Saturn is
Saturn.
like a planner, you know, of a system. or
Organizer.
Organizer.
An organizer, a
A
planner.
wedding planner.
Mhm. Except that it's mixed because it's a party, but you have to have some Saturn to be able to do the event planning.
Or the people who design systems for organizations, you know, like, I don't know,
Systems analyst.
systems analysts and that kind of thing, or
Yes, will one of you write these down for me so I can expand the list?
Just a good systems analyst.
Systems analyst, that's great. Keep going, you guys. I'm getting all revved up.
we've got planner. Have we got planner?
Yes.
Have we? Oh.
Yeah, but it could also be an urban planner, a
Yeah.
city planner.
Any kind of planning.
Or businessman or stockbroker.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Right. Yeah, we have a commodities broker
Purchasing
down here,
agent.
purchasing agent. Anybody who works wholesale. Saturn governs wholesale, Jupiter governs retail. So Saturn is in there getting the deal on the best price, buying, 6 gross of this or that in order to get it for 2 cents a piece. That's the way Saturn works. So Saturn is the wholesale market.
I mean, this probably isn't right, but would somebody who does mining?
Yes, I think we have miner on
Oh,
the
we have
list.
got miner. Oh, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
so somebody who does mining would be a miner,
Oh, sorry, I didn't even remember that.
as opposed to a minor, M-I-N-O-R, because Saturn would actually represent old age. So the geriatric, and anybody who works with old people in nursing homes, there are people who specialize in geriatrics, geriatric physicians and nursing home operators.
What about guardians? Well, that's the same thing as protective services, but a guardian.
Right, but that's it's an additional word. Any guardian of any kind would be Saturn. Any bodyguard would be Saturn. I don't think I have that
Like
down.
people who do power, like the power of attorney or the enduring power of attorney, that'd be all in the protective service thing. You know.
Right, because if you're taking on power of attorney, what are you taking on?
Guardianship.
You're taking on responsibility.
Would an executor of a will be in this?
An executor or executrix would also come under this. So please, everybody, write these down and email it to me. Estate planners, yes. Retirement planners. Now we're getting great ideas. Person who plans your retirement.
There you go, yeah.
There was a suggestion about president.
Presidents do take on responsibility, but we would actually assign the leader of any country to the sun.
But
Which
they
is-
get gray early these days.
They get,
And they actually have, as long as I've been alive, which is not that long, but long enough. I have noticed if you see the photograph taken of the president at their inauguration, and 4 years later, what happens? They age tremendously. So I think Saturn is in there, but if we were to pick one signature, we would pick the sun. But it's obvious when you're in that position. The President of the United States turns gray in 4 years, regardless of what age they went in at.
I'm looking for the grey hairs in the barber every time I see it. I have a couple more. I don't know if they're within the sphere of all this, but recycler, conservation person,
These are great. Some of them.
conservator,
A conservator.
a garbage worker.
Yes,
could they?
garbage collectors.
Yep.
Collectors of any kind.
Pawnbroker.
Yes, pawnbroker, thrift store,
Thrift
operator.
And right, yeah, and anyone who's involved in a recycling plant of some kind, you know.
So you have to make a copy of that page before you leave
You
tonight.
can't read
So-
my writing. I'll give you
Oh,
a copy.
okay.
Good luck.
Sorry,
Oh no, I'll give you a copy.
you're probably right. I can't read through it.
I'll give you a copy.
All right, let's talk about the Saturn personality. Been a while before we've had a quote, so hey, Delineating the Horoscope by C.C. Say. The Saturn person loves efficiency, economy, and organization. His best field is that of businessman. He is shrewd and can buy to advantage, but in selling does better to employ another. Imagine that. His best quality is system. His worst quality is selfishness. He will abandon trickery when he realizes that honesty is the best policy. He has a horror of waste and can wait patiently for his plans to mature. The thoughts ruled by this planet are called the safety thoughts.
It's almost like this whole thing is a bit like people who don't have a lot of faith. That would be the extreme on the other side, the fear-based. You know, I guess that might be the part of the antidote. Yeah.
Venus is actually the antidote to Saturn, though the opposite, we might say, is Jupiter.
Right.
But Venus is the antidote, in that the urges are different, but they're able to blend with Saturn in such a way that they harmonize. The thing about Jupiter is it's just so antipathetic to Saturn that they don't necessarily harmonize. Okay, and since we need another quote. Oh, this is from Horary Astrology. The description of Saturn: large bones. Looks raw-boned even when not tall. Dark, serious gray. I like to use Abraham Lincoln as a good example of a Saturnine visual. Tall, big bones, very dark, sallow features, serious looking. Was there ever a picture of him smiling?
No, but that's part of the kind of culture of that time with photos. Yeah.
That would have been frivolous.
Apparently, he had a lot of he had a good sense of humour, and he wasn't. People kind of typecast him as being depressed all the time, but apparently he had.
It was probably manic depressive, so he had his up periods and his.
Yeah, but he had actually apparently very great humour as well. But I don't. Yeah, that's only us from looking at documentaries and getting beyond the photo.
Right, he had a good sense of humor and an overall attractive personality.
Yeah.
You don't get to be president without
Right.
being attractive to people.
Yeah.
But definitely Saturnine.
Yeah, suffered from great despondency and depression.
Yeah. Would dignified come in this?
I think of that as the sun, but I think of Saturn dignity as being reserved.
Reserved.
Yeah, a reserved dignity. I think of the sun dignity as the type of dignity of somebody who conducts themselves with a calm self-assurance, and they are two different qualities. The Saturn person is always somehow in restraint. You usually get less than what you want from them, rather than a servant. So, this is from Beginner's Horoscope Maker and Reader. This is a great book, and I believe Janice Butler wrote me yesterday and told me that she found one online at Amazon.com. And of course, if all of you go start looking for them now, it'll probably drive up the cost of the book. But, nevertheless, watch Amazon, look online. Every once in a while, this book will pop up and you can get it for a good price.
What's it called?
Beginner's Horoscope Maker and Reader, and it's written on just every one of the handouts I've given in the last 7 weeks.
It was originally published as 2 publications.
Yes, the Beginner's Horoscope Maker and the Beginner's Horoscope Reader. And the Reader is really what we're working with in this class, though the Maker, if one was to go back and learn how to calculate a chart, I would recommend the Beginner's Horoscope Maker over Course 8 or Astrology or Course 10, where you could pull out your hair trying to read and understand that book. So it actually has a really good step-by-step way of casting a chart.
Renee says, I think the saving everything tendency we may be stuck with due to our strong Saturn is important in this throwaway world. Especially in elementary schools, we need people that have physical resource and not just a picture on on the computer.
Correct. And again, I don't have a strong Saturn, but I have plenty of Capricorn, and I am a lover of recycling and reusing items, and I love recycled art. To me, the greatest creativity is one can take a castaway object and turn it into art. And there are extremes, and what we're talking about here are the extremes. When you look at the house where somebody suffers from hoarding syndrome, that is an extreme, which actually can become very unhealthy, rather than one who may, naturally put aside newspapers and then turn it into a project for third graders of paper mache or making paper hats or putting it to some good use, as opposed to somebody who just accumulates out of fear. And for some, what I have found, elders that hold on to everything, each item actually functions as a mnemonic device it corresponds with a place in their memory. So the item itself becomes the physical memory for them. So,
And I think sometimes when people are hoarders who aren't old, that function, it's like everything's kind of from in here out there, and it's kind of a security thing because there's I don't know, some kind of cognitive thing going on here, but often there'll be reasons, but they're not reasonable, for keeping things.
right. Take a picture of it, file it on a CD-ROM, and give it away. That's what I say.
That's the easiest, yeah. And how many times will you actually end up looking at the picture? Probably not that much, but it's one way to break that attachment to the object that's filling up the space.
What you're talking about was probably an unconscious way of trying to alleviate the fear that you have about the uncertainty, and that's, things may not be there when you need them.
And it's a sort of a pretty warped way of claiming self-sufficiency or something like that sometimes too.
Right, and again, any one of these planets can be moved to an extreme, and we see it coming up as forms of mental illness. So, from Beginner's Horoscope Maker and Reader, the bony structure of the body, traits which stabilize the character and ability to conserve or hoard material possessions, are expressions of the thought cells ruled by Saturn.
Is self-reliance part of this picture?
Mm-hmm.
Did we already put that in there somewhere?
I don't remember, but write it down.
Yeah.
These thought cells, which so powerfully influence acquisition, fear, persistence, and selfishness, have been organized in lower forms of life through experiences in seeking security, such as in fleeing from enemies and hoarding food. Because their chief expression relates to obtaining safety, they are called safety thought cells. Aspects to Saturn affect the life through work, responsibility, economy, or loss. To the extent that the thought cells mapped by Saturn are active, is the life influenced by thoughts of safety, secrecy, acquisitiveness, covetousness, buying, trading, casualty, comparison, worry, fear, greed, selfishness, system, order, or persistence? There's more. When Saturn is prominent in the birth chart, it denotes one who works hard, is shrewd, and can buy to advantage, but in selling does better to employ another. Am I repeating myself?
Well,
Yeah.
not quite.
I think he is repeating himself. He has a leaning towards business, is a lover of efficiency, economy, and organization, and has the patience to wait for plans to mature. When prominent and afflicted, he tends to become self-centered and unscrupulous in taking advantage of others. The earlier he realizes that selfishness does not pay, that honesty is the most profitable policy, and devotes his energy to developing systems to eliminate waste and inefficiency, The quicker he will gain the success he desires. Also, beginner's horoscope maker and reader.
Christopher?
All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you liked that quickie intermission we surprised you with. I am going to repeat myself for those of you that did not get the last minute of what I was saying. And those that did get it are now out of the room. When Saturn is prominent in the birth chart, it denotes one who works hard, is shrewd, and can buy to advantage, but in selling does better to employ another. He has a leaning towards business, is a lover of efficiency, economy, and organization, and has the patience to wait for plans to mature. When prominent and afflicted, he tends to become self-centered and unscrupulous in taking advantage of others. The earlier he realizes that selfishness does not pay, that honesty is the most profitable policy, and devotes his energy to developing a system to eliminate waste and inefficiency, the quicker he will gain the success he desires. Remember that last sentence. It's something we could all live by. And that is from Beginner's Horoscope Maker and Reader by Albert Benjamin. So, one of the things that I've noticed in recent years, one of the ways in which I've seen society changing with the advent of computers, email, iPhones, 1-800 numbers, etc. It used to be 20 years ago that my clients were quite fine with calling, making an appointment 2 weeks out in time, and then showing up for an appointment. What I found myself pondering on this week is how many persons call, want you to immediately be available, and when not, they might send an appointment and then call back a day or two later and cancel. That there's this element, as Zane says, waiting patiently for things to develop, which is one of the ores of Saturn we all need to develop. Even kids in school. The ability to work on art projects that might take days, something like paper mache, where you have to wait for drying periods between layers of paper and paint, is almost becoming unheard of in this culture of immediacy that we're now living in. So there are actually very good qualities of Saturn that are sort of slowly slipping out of existence as we become more insane in our immediate needs. All right, this is the chart of a dominant Saturn personality. And in this chart, one can see that Saturn is here at 15 Sagittarius in conjunction with both the Ascendant and Mercury. Although Saturn is tucked away in the 12th house of secret matters, introspection, and one's inner life, we will see, because of the conjunction with the Ascendant, how this has impacted this woman's personality. If we were to look at the astrodynes, we can see Saturn is here at the top of the list. And again, if you're watching this online, I highly recommend that you pull out your handouts, go to the last page or two, and somewhere in there, you'll actually find a sample of the chart. Which
Page 7.
it'll be easier to read than looking at this on screen. Saturn has 11.1% of the power in this chart, and we can see at a glance that there is actually a high proportion of power divided between Saturn, the Moon, and Mercury. Oftentimes you'll have in a chart, we might say that somebody's head is ruled by 3 different planets, that they're competing or fighting for dominance. And each of these qualities will show up strongly in the makeup of that individual. But nevertheless, the most powerful planet in a chart dominates. One of the reasons for that is generally the way in which the planet receives power is not just house position. Here we have Saturn in a cadent house, which we usually consider to be weak. But because of the aspects formed by Saturn and being in conjunction with the Ascendant, there is strength happening here. So Saturn is mild in its discord in this chart. It has a negative 7.86, which is discordant enough, but nevertheless, it is not as discordant as it might otherwise be.
If somebody was going to have like what you call a good Saturn, what would you kind of be thinking of in terms of power and percentage and harmony?
Well, power is just that. It makes not necessarily a good Saturn, but it makes a dominant Saturn. That means that this woman is ruled both by her sense of system, organization, shrewdness, conservativeness, sense of caution, and possibly also functions in life with a sense of fear, sorrow, loss, and hardship.
Right. So that's like motivation. A lot of it's
motivation. And again, if you have a dominant Saturn, how might that impact you in your motivation? You might live in a house with a security system, or a car that has one. Maybe you carry mace. I mean, those are all safety thoughts. You might actually have a retirement plan or savings for a rainy day. Money, what was it? Last year, there was a brief news article about a woman in Israel. And her daughter, her loving daughter, wanted to surprise her and buy her a new mattress. She had been sleeping on this old mattress for over 10 years. So what her daughter did was ordered a new, lovely new mattress and took the old mattress to the dump. Mother came home and flipped her wig because there was over $1 million stuffed into her old mattress.
Oh my God. Can you imagine?
That is a Saturn personality for you. Where is a safer place to have your money than you sleeping on top of it at night? This is somebody who was planning for the future in an extreme way, didn't trust banks or even safe deposit boxes.
Was there a follow-up to the story?
I never saw
I
it.
didn't hear a follow-up to
Yeah.
that either.
I think the follow-up to the story is weeping, wailing, mourning, and gnashing of teeth.
Well, they didn't go down to the dump and find that nobody else wanted it and they got the mattress back.
We should go Google
I
that
think,
story
yeah.
and see what happened.
One should
Or did the pickers
Yes,
get
would
it?
somebody please go look that up on here?
Jeez.
That's not this woman.
That's,
So where does Saturn get its power from in this chart? Let's talk about the sign in which it falls. Saturn and Sagittarius. What's that like?
That would be tough, wouldn't it?
That's there every 28 years. This is the late 1950s generation where for 2.5 years Saturn was in Sagittarius.
Well, you would be really cautious in planning your adventures.
That would be
And choosing your
whitewater rafting with a life vest.
There you go.
Or doing your rock climbing at the gym.
and have a good insurance policy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
It's in Sagittarius, so one could be also, what, conservative in their philosophies? One could adhere to very traditional ways of thinking, praying, meditating, philosophizing. One might be actually cautious in their self-expression, though with the Sun and Mercury and the Ascendant in Sagittarius, there is a tendency to be outspoken.
Yeah. But strict. There would be a strictness to that.
Yeah, there could be a self-editing
Yeah.
process involved. Diplomacy might come into play, which would be unusual associated with.
A very structured and planned approach to. Is religious stuff in Sag, or is that Jupiter?
Sagittarius does govern one's philosophies and religious
A
life.
very formal, ritualized kind of religious.
Yeah, one might follow an orthodoxy of some kind and get great sense of structure, stability, and solace from that. And it could be Orthodox Catholicism, it could be Orthodox Buddhism, or Orthodox anythingism. But going in a very strict, structured, by the rules way. It's in the 12th house of one's chart. What does that govern? Subconscious mind. I like to call the 12th house inner space. In ancient, what I like to call old-timey astrology, stuff from 2,500 years ago, the 12th house is not a good thing. The 12th house is what you look to see if you're going to become a slave or not. Which, back in those days, the likelihood of one's life being just upset and being somehow, taken or sold into slavery could happen at any point. You upset a ruling person and you could lose your liberty. So the 12th house represented this.
Well, it rules institutions, doesn't it?
Right, and one is enslaved in institutions, and the institutions the 12th house rules can be anything from a monastery or ashram to a mental institution.
Yeah, or a workhouse.
A workhouse, yeah.
Is this 12th house karmic? Or is it other?
Everything's karma.
Well, I mean, but what I mean is that some of them govern more that kind of dynamic, don't they?
I don't know the answer to that.
Is it about oppression?
It can be oppression, it can also be one's addiction. So I think in the contemporary society, where we're not always so much enslaved to other people, though you hear about it, that whether it's mail-order brides or immigrants who are smuggled in and have to work for, as indentured servants for years until they get their liberty, or women sold into white slavery or whatever. There are still institutions out there where people lose their liberties, and more in other countries than we know about here. But it does still exist, but one can be a slave to their addictions, whatever that might be.
And could also be exploitation in this house as well?
Yes, and any situation where we may feel that we're confined. So Saturn dominant in the 12th house means one may have lived a life behind high walls somehow. Whether they're the ones with the razor wire on it, or there are other things that can restrict us in the way in which we live due to status, station in society, publicity, visibility, etc. All has a way of forming and conforming us. And my guess is how this operates in this chart. And this isn't somebody I know personally, nor have I read much biography on, but one could also function in life with a great sense of worry, sense of cautiousness, need for security, and that could possibly be based on life experiences. So let's look at the aspects here.
Well, that parallel is the most powerful.
I think you are right.
And then
Is
that
this
the
working?
conjunction to the ascendant.
There. So, There is the conjunction to the ascendant, but if we move over parallel from the Sun to Saturn is truly the most powerful, 9.38. In terms of the hard aspects, the conjunction to the ascendant is strong. If we go back to the description, you know, raw-boned, bony, tall, angular, serious in appearance, that could possibly come into application here with Saturn conjuncting the ascendant. Could make for a fearful personality, or a self-preserving personality, or a self-protective personality. And that'll become clear when we come to a quote from her. So, where is some more power here? We have a conjunction of Saturn and Mercury, which visually we can see right here in the chart. They're 8 degrees apart. But nevertheless, what we're seeing here is a Saturn Ascendant Mercury conjunction. So the sense of self, the ascendant, and the self-expression is being straddled by the safety urges and the intellectual urges. This is somebody who's probably a lot smarter than us. This could be a very keen, insightful, again, this is Sagittarius, I see, intellect, legalistic mind, keen with details, with retentive memory, just as Saturn hoards in hoarding syndrome. Saturn-Mercury conjunctions can hoard thoughts, can have a retentive memory, hold on to the details of things.
They like order.
Or
They want their
universe to have order.
I know, because I have it.
Okay, well, so does she. This is Carolyn Kennedy.
Oh,
Here's a quote. The press is coming up against something that is very fragile, and that is personal and individual solitude, and that is personal and individual solitude and dignity. How's that for Saturn conjuncting the ascendant in the 12th house? There's a quote for you. That so describes this personality and this planet. So this is somebody whose sense of safety is tied up with solitude and personal solitude and dignity. Don't tread in my space, you know. Don't be pointing your cameras in my windows. And of course, this is someone, most of us are of the generation when we can remember when she was born. And watching the Kennedy years through the White House. And all of this family constantly being in the spotlight. What else do we know about this family? Does she have any living relatives?
Not too many.
None from her immediate family. Her youngest brother died in infancy. Her father was assassinated shortly thereafter. Her mother died, 20 years later, and then her brother died. So there has to be an incredible, one has lived a life with a heavy burden of loss, which is Saturn. Saturn attracts losses. And some over 10 years ago, I remember seeing a show on PBS, which had to do with centenarians, anyone who lived over 100 years. And the common theme that came up, that when you live that long, the thing you have to develop is a strategy for loss. Because guess what? By then, just about everyone you have ever known has predeceased you.
That's true. It's interesting because when she was communicating, when she was running for office or whatever, she did not have a good way, means of communication at all. She did not come across.
Very reserved.
Reserved, stilted, cautious.
Yeah, it wasn't, coherent almost.
Right.
It was almost incoherent.
And what could that have been from? Do you think she may have been paralyzed by fear?
Yeah.
Right, because here you've got the safety urges. I mean, her father and uncle were assassinated as politicians. Well, that could cure anyone from wanting to enter that field of work, you think? So you've got a figure here that Saturn on the Ascendant also creates that sense of tightness or constraint in personal expression. She's a Sag. She has to be a wonderful person.
Oh, I think so.
Yeah, but she may not come across like one.
I think she felt responsible, like she had to do this, and
Right.
didn't really want
Yeah.
to.
And where does responsibility come from?
Saturn.
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 So yes, this could definitely have been done out of duty.
But that's also a family thing there too, in ways, isn't it?
Mhm.
A family.
But also, we could see from this quote that she probably doesn't, especially with this strong sense of privacy, doesn't want her family living in a fishbowl and everyone peering in. It's none of their business. So who is she? The only surviving family member of President John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. She is an attorney and an author. So Saturn conjunct Mercury in Sagittarius, conjunct the Ascendant. That energy has been put to good work. And my guess is with that conjunction, she is probably better at expressing herself in writing than extemporaneously in front of the public. What do you get to do when you write?
You get to think about
Yeah.
it.
And you get to edit
Organize it.
before you put it out in front of
And the same
everyone.
thing with the attorney. It's like very careful usage of communication.
You write your brief,
Yeah.
and then you present it.
And you're very careful about the words you choose and how you do it. And that's interesting.
Historians, since she was a child, have described her as remote and shy.
Would she describe herself as that?
Probably Sun in the 12th house. Yeah, maybe not remote, because that's not a warm, cuddly word, but she might describe herself as somebody who is profoundly introspective and private, rather than remote and shy. But we might have to read her autobiography if it ever comes out and find out how she describes
Will
herself.
there be one?
Oh, true. So let's talk about aspects. Aspects bring both power and conditioning to a chart. And basically, we have aspects that are weak, and we have aspects that are powerful. We have aspects that bring in harmony, aspects which are neutral, and aspects which bring in discord. Although it looks like we have 11 aspects up here, the parallel and the contraparallel operates just as one aspect. Neutral aspects that are powerful are the conjunction and the parallel aspect. Conjunction we went over when we did the Sun 7 weeks ago, which is any planets that are in the same degree. Parallels, any planets in the same degree north or south of the equator. These are intensity aspects. They're not measured by longitude, they're measured by declination. Many people don't use them because of that. It's an additional calculation that used to have to be done by hand, and now it's so much easier.
Is that an ancient kind of thing, the parallels?
I don't know the history of the parallel. I don't know how far back it goes, and that would be something for me to study.
And the other one is the contraparallel. What does that actually mean?
A parallel aspect is when two planets are, let's say, at 20 degrees north of the equator, or 20 degrees south of the equator. A contraparallel is one planet is 20 degrees north, the other is 20 degrees south. The harmonious aspects that are powerful are the trine and the sextile, and weak, the semisextile. But nevertheless, each of these brings something to the plate, whether it's growth, opportunity, or luck. Discordant aspects, we have powerfully the opposition and the square, and more mildly the inconjunct, sesqui square, and the semi-square. The inconjunct is neutral, 150 degrees. So basically, that's how energy is divided in a chart. We can look at it according to whether it's weak or powerful, whether it's harmonious, neutral, or discordant.
So there's more opportunity to be discordant than to be harmonious, isn't there?
And you might find that in your life as well.
Right.
Maybe
Yeah.
it's the human condition.
I think it is not just the human condition
just the
alone,
physical
it's the
condition.
condition of experience in form.
Huh. Yeah.
It is the nature of experience with form, because you could be a single-celled amoeba and still suffer in life, because you have, based on your environment, either access to the nutrients you need or a lack of access to them. When you're a single-celled organism, you don't have to worry about finding a suitable mate. Why? You can do cell division. But once you start getting more complex than that, then there's this whole other realm of suffering that comes into your life based on relationship. So,
We don't know whether they have conflict between the division of the cell.
well, that's true. There could be internal conflict. I don't like you anymore. I'm separating. You could be onto something.
It's paradoxical.
Yes. I'll never look at an amoeba in the same way.
What's a bit compassion?
So, in the theme of Saturn, which is powerful and discordant in a chart, remember Saturn's the major malefic. If you have Saturn in your chart, chances are you've got something to work on. So, the aspect that is most closely aligned to the qualities of Saturn is the opposition. Why? It is a powerful aspect, and it is a disruptive aspect, a discordant aspect. We call the opposition a separation compound. And if you look at the diagram here, the symbol for it looks like barbells. I mean, truly oppositions are where we're doing weightlifting in our life. But primarily what's indicated here is one planet is pulling against the urges of the other planet. They are both compelled towards one another, but the energy is also repellent. They tend to separate from one another. So it is profound, it's powerful, it's dynamic, and it's disruptive. The opposition is formed whenever two planets are 180 degrees or 6 signs apart. As the word opposition implies, they are opposite to one another in a chart. Planets in Aries will oppose planets in Libra. Planets in Taurus oppose planets in Scorpio. Planets in Gemini oppose planets in Sagittarius, so on and so forth. Now, the opposition is more powerful than the square, but we consider it to be less cataclysmic than the square. And the reason for this, when we studied the square 2 weeks ago, the nature of the square is like running an obstacle course. If you study your chart and look where you have squares, these are themes in your life that tend to come up repeatedly. You may get through one phase, And could be a week later, could be 3 years later, could be a decade later, the theme tends to return. And you find yourself going through this process again. The thing about opposition is these are planets in a tug of war. They are pulling on one another. Generally speaking, in an opposition, the planet that wins is the most powerful of the planets. So you have to look at your opposition and decide which planet has more energy by astrodyne power. And that planet will generally tend to dominate. So what happens is the way you resolve these conflicts is you just decide, what I'm going to do is give in to the more dominant pole in the opposition. And then you work to harmonize that.
Christopher?
Yes.
Alice Marie asked, does Hermetics use the YOD?
No, it's not a part of Hermetics, but a yod is going to be seen in a chart, and I believe that's when you have one planet that stands out from the rest of the chart. I'm not sure. Maybe, Alice Marie, you could write in what a yod is. But I think it's when one planet forms in conjuncts to two different planets.
She did parentheses, two in conjuncts.
Yeah. So, no, we don't recognize it as anything special like we might a grand cross or a T-square or a grand trine. But we would see it as a planet engaged in two inconjuncts. And inconjuncts are weak aspects. And we'd look to, and they're neutral aspects. So we'd look to see which of those inconjuncts was more powerful and house position, etc. So, the opposition. Again, this last statement too. The result is a constant antagonism between the activities ruled by the two planets. This constant struggle for supremacy between the two planets does not act abruptly, nor in acute crises like the square aspect, but develops slowly and unrelentingly. So Mars or squares are acute, Saturn or oppositions are chronic. These are those long-term issues that go on in your life. What do we do when we have opposition? We learn to make choices. Why? If you don't learn to make choices, your life is spent constantly in this battle between these two conflicting desires that are trying to reconcile with one another. And sometimes you just decide in your life that you're going to give up the battle. You're going to give up the internal conflict and just pick one. And other times you don't.
Yeah, but as soon as you pick one,
Then there's a lot of
Well,
imbalanced
that's
stuff
what-
going.
yeah,
Yeah,
right.
exactly. It'll hound you if it's not.
is there any way to create a drain?
Yeah.
Like,
You
I know
can
there are
only
natural
hope that
drains.
you have one
Right.
naturally.
Yeah.
And that is called a conciliating factor in a chart. And God bless you if you have an opposition in your chart, but that you have one planet in your chart that forms a trine to one and a sextile to the other. That becomes the conciliating factor.
A trine to one and a what?
Sextile to the other. I have one of those in my chart.
Right.
And it is my...
It gives you a place to go where you
Yeah,
can integrate
exactly.
the two otherwise disparate urges.
I have only one opposition in my chart, which is the moon opposing the ascendant, which is a long and lifelong antagonism. But the sun forms a trine to the ascendant and a sextile to the moon in my chart. So whenever I go to where the sun is in my chart and spend my time and energy there, the other conflict dissipates because it's being distracted into constructive activity.
So is that kind of functioning a bit like an antidote?
It does.
So it's another
Right.
form of what you can go to.
Not everyone has that, though.
So how does the natural antidote to those planets in the opposition, how do they...
The challenge
compare
for
to
me, the ascendant doesn't have an antidote. It's although we give it the power of a planet, we function with it as a planet. It isn't a planet. It does not have an urge. It just has a function in our lives. Whereas, the moon has an urge.
Right.
So, and that has to find expression. And in my chart, it's the stronger of the pole. So it's easier to focus on that.
Do you have something called vertex in your system?
I don't know what that is, vortex.
Vertex. I'll have to look it up.
Okay.
But I think there's a point. It's a bit like ascendant and all that. It's a certain point, I think, before. I'm not sure before where your first house is, or not first house, but your sun or something.
There are all types of Arabic points out there, midpoints. There are fixed stars. There are asteroids. I mean, there are so many things that some people incorporate into their systems. And what I actually like about the Hermetic system is, before we look at nodes or any other thing, we look to see if it can't be explained first by a planet, sign, house, or aspect. And invariably, you can almost always find an explanation if you look carefully at those 4 factors. So for me, I like the simplicity of the system. There's still 100,000 combinations, if not more, that you can get by just working with the 4 factors. And then there are other people that do like to add, what I call everything in the kitchen sink astrology.
But then it gets really complicated.
It gets so complicated, and I like the old keep it simple, stupid approach.
Although I must say, sometimes, you can get a little different perspective sometimes by looking at some of the other different sets of insights. But
Yeah, no sense. Some people do. Is there a question or a statement from the audience?
A statement. Phil says, what if someone has 6 oppositions?
Yes, that was our, growing up in the atomic age, duck and cover was something we practiced weekly. So, imagining you might be from that generation, hopefully you were well exercised. 6 oppositions. We're going to have that, I think, coming up at the end of May this year. There's going to be a time period where there are like 6 oppositions going on in the heavens. And again, there will be people born at that time. And basically, if you have that, chances are you have a conflicted life.
Or compartmentalized.
Or possibly a compartmentalized life where you've decided that each of these areas functions separately from one another. And the only thing one can do is constantly work on a daily basis to reconcile opposing desires and develop strategies for making up your mind. Because I have only one opposition, but it is tied into a T-square in my chart, one of the decisions I made in my 20s was basically not to contradict myself. If I said I was going out the door and going down the left side of the street, I would do that and stick to it. If I made a plan with someone, I would not change plans when something better came along to do. I would stick with the original plan. So it was developing a habit system of self-consistency. That's how I worked with it. And that's having only one opposition. So, as they say in Oklahoma, bless your heart.
One more question.
Yes.
Jan asks, how do you work with an opposition to the midheaven?
Those depend because they can be either in the 3rd or 4th house, and house position dictates how we work with them. Oppositions from the 4th house to the midheaven oftentimes indicate that in order to pursue our goals, the midheaven, what we want to do, we are in some ways not pleasing our family. And from the 3rd house, it can oftentimes represent somebody who is self-sabotaging about their goals, their ambitions, just in their own thoughts alone. And so it's developing a habit system of not standing in your own way mentally. And we're actually 10 minutes from ending, and we haven't even made it to the planets through these signs or the planets through the houses. So I'm just going to pull out one opposition here, which is from the moon to Uranus in this chart.
That's also in the T-square.
Moon 15 Aquarius, Uranus 11 Leo, and yes, they form a T-square to Mars, which we won't talk about tonight because of time restriction, but you have the domestic urges in a separation compound with the individualistic urges. They're in houses of finance. Moon opposing Uranus. Moon can also represent the mother. I'm sure there was some conflict over the mother's estate and perhaps how it was written or distributed for this woman, being how personal finances are affected by other people's money, estates, etc. It might also be considering that even her brother, I think he and his fiancée were killed at the same time. So, or I don't know if they were married, fiancé or wife. But that would also mean that there could be estate conflicts also tied up over his substantial estate and who might inherit with this opposition. Again, Moon opposing Uranus also creates very erratic moods, a type of mental instability, but also somebody who can have flashes of inspiration. You have the Uranian thinking where you bypass normal intellectual processes and it comes across in the form of a mood or realization. But there are always going to be issues tied into resources. Personal wealth, 2nd house, and other people's money, the 8th house. So, have a trustworthy accountant and estate planner. We already mentioned this, 29 years through the zodiac, 2.5 years in each sign. Where Saturn falls in your chart impacts the way in which you might be conservative, how you might be conservative, and where you might be self-serving. The other thing that's important, it's not only where our safety urges express, but each of the signs of the zodiac, from Aries the head down to Pisces the feet, represents a zone in the body. Because Saturn is in nature discordant, has a tendency towards deficiency and restrictions, there is a good chance that the sign in your chart where Saturn falls will be in a zone of your body where you have problems. Pay attention over the course of your life, and you might see, the issues coming up there.
So manifesting as deficiencies of some kind, rather than there wouldn't be excesses, just
Or things or constipations, things that aren't moving. Saturn can either be a deficiency or where something's stuck.
stuck. Okay.
Is that the computer or someone's car? Oh, outside.
There's a follow-through. Alice Marie says Carolyn Kennedy had to make a financial settlement with John's wife's family.
Oh,
Okay. Thank you for filling us in. That's a good detail. All right, Saturn in Aries. I'm going to rush through all of these, so I probably won't be taking any input from the audience here, either at a distance or in the room. With the safety thought cells expressing from the I am attitude, security should be sought through caution and circumspection rather than through contention and abrupt action. Saturn in Aries, you could deal with headaches, head injuries, sinus problems, possibly. Ear issues, hearing issues. Saturn in Taurus, with the safety thought cells expressing from the I have attitude, security should be sought not in hoarding money, but in wisely putting it to active use. Saturn in Taurus, you need to watch the area of the neck and throat and what could even be tumors in that area. Saturn in Gemini, with the safety thought cells expressing from the I think attitude, security should be sought through system and action rather than in words. Saturn in Gemini, issues can be related to the bronchia or what might be the shoulders, arms, and hands. This could be carpal tunnel or, chronic tightness or things like shoulder problems, rotator cuff issues. Saturn in Cancer, with the safety thought cells expressing from the I feel attitude, security should be sought through intuition rather than through taking the advice of others. Again, stomach and breast are ruled by Cancer. Saturn is at his detriment in Cancer, where his sober nature can lead to depression or a maudlin personality. It's opposite his home in Capricorn. Saturn in Leo, with the safety thought cells expressing from the I will attitude, security should be sought in healthful recreation rather than in show and display. Part of the body is the spine and back. Saturn in Leo can bring in issues with spine fractures, scoliosis, back related. Saturn is at his detriment in Leo. Again, it's opposite his other home, which is Aquarius, where his sense of caution can create repressed self-expression. Leos want to roar. Saturn in Leo is like constantly having the lion tamer there with the chair and whip pointed at you. Saturn in Virgo, with the safety thought cells expressing from the I analyze attitude, security should be sought in system and order rather than in frugality and arduous labor. Oh, come on. We all want arduous labor. Saturn in Virgo, this can be constipation, issues with intestines and bowels. Irritable bowel syndrome, things like that. Well, that's more Mars in Virgo, but Saturn's more the deficiency and or tumors, polyps, blockages. Saturn is at his harmony in Virgo, where his systematic nature can accomplish through science and analysis. They are happy bedfellows, Saturn and Virgo. And so what if there's a little arduous labor thrown in? Saturn in Libra, with the safety thought cells expressing from the I balance attitude, security should be sought in calm judgment rather than in the approbation of associates. Libra is the lower back and the renal area, the kidney area. So Saturn there can be prone to kidney stone and or renal failure or, I forget what the...
Nephritis.
Nephritis, yes. Saturn is at his exaltation in Libra, where his judicious nature can pass judgment. With the safety thought cells expressing from the I desire attitude, security should be sought in careful attention to details rather than in forceful action. Scorpio, reproductive areas, and also the sinus cavity in the head is Scorpio ruled. So, prostrate, colon, ovaries, uterus can all be considered under Scorpio rulership. Sagittarius, with the safety thought cells expressing from the IC attitude, security should be sought in faith and comprehension rather than in impulse and taking hazards. Sagittarius rules the hips, thighs, lower back, so this could be prone to sciatica or problems with the hip sockets. With the safety urges expressing from the I use attitude, security should be sought through serving the public faithfully rather than through actions that are self-centered. We're going to speed on quickly and we will not get through the houses tonight, but you all have the notes on that and you'll be able to study on your own privately. Knees. Saturn in Capricorn governs the areas of the knees. Saturn is considered to be at home in Capricorn, the sign of business and social standing. So there is a concern with status, position, honor. Saturn is also at home in Aquarius, with the safety thought cells expressing through the personality, persistence and shrewdness are shown. These, used to benefit society, will bring more honor and gain to self. Calves and ankles. Saturn is at home in Aquarius, the sign of social responsibility. Pisces, with the safety thought cells expressing from the I believe attitude, security should be sought in self-confident action rather than in anxiety and worry. Always easier said than done. And Pisces governs the feet. So this could be problems with the bones in the feet, corns, ingrown nails, those type of issues. Bone spurs. Saturn is at his inharmony in Pisces, where he can be prone to fear and anxiety. So that's the end of tonight's class. What I'd like you to do is study the rest of the notes on your own. Go ahead and work with the self-analysis page, self-reflection page, where Saturn falls in your chart. Do this as your homework this week. It should be very insightful. And study the notes on Saturn as it moves through each of the houses. Remember, wherever Saturn falls in your chart, that area is subject to poverty. So this is a realm of your life where you have restrictions, and what you gain through that house position comes through great effort and struggle. All right, thank you all for coming. We have 3 more classes. Starting next week, we are moving into the realm of the upper octave planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. So that will take us through to the end of this month, and then we have a brief break, and we'll be back in April to study progressions in action and how to interpret what and when events will happen in your life. All right, good night.